Hello, my name is David Beaumark, and I'm here today with Alex Cuthbert. Alex, could you please start with introducing yourself and what you do?
Yeah, certainly, David. I'm Alex Cuthbert. I'm one of the study skills advisors with the Study Skills Service at Strathclyde. As we're going to discuss the conversation with David, our service is going to be rebranded and relaunched in the coming year as a learner development service. So that probably, if I use the terms interchangeably, that's why. And I've been involved with working with neurodiverse learners over a number of years, both at Strathclyde since 2012 and at Glasgow from 2006. But my background and experience of working in diverse learning, if I can use it in a all-encompassing way, dates back to 1994 when I worked as a classroom assistant. It wasn't the job title at the time, but language is no doubt discussed, has changed a lot in recent years. In 1994, I started working in a primary school with some young people who had, as it was described then, complex learning difficulties, and that included many of the experiences we'd now recognise as neurodiversity. And as those young people came of secondary age, I transferred to the catchment secondary school with them for continuity, along with members of teaching staff and other support staff that worked with us. So I followed a group of learners through for some of them it was even their nursery experience, their preschool experience, primary school, and then through into secondary school. So my kind of background in involving work with diverse learning kind of dates back for that period.
Right. Oh, so continue.
Not at all, David, absolutely.
Yes, so we've had conversations before, and when we were planning this Neurodiversity Celebration Week, I was thinking, oh, I think Alex could be a really good person to include here. And my first thought was that maybe you could have a talk about how neurodiverse students can learn in different ways and like give different examples. But then you had a different idea. Why don't you tell me about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm very keen to emphasise is my profession as a learning developer. Foremost, that's where my qualifications lie, and it's where my professional accreditations and experiences are. And as a learning developer, we are very keen not to position ourselves as experts in any given topic other than learning development. So it's something of a circular argument to an extent, but it means that the conversations we have and the experiences that we're involved in is very driven by the learners we're working with there and then in that moment. To do that, of course, we draw upon our professional and academic experience, but it needs to be very reflective of the context of the conversation. And it is a very conversation-driven discipline. It needs to be dialogic. So we're moving away, and part of our rebranding as a learner development service reflects the transition that Strathclyde and lots of other universities, many of which have made before us, if we're being entirely honest, have moved to academic literacies-based approaches rather than a deficit skill-based model for learning. And there is certainly a place for skills within learning, but learning encompasses so many more experiences than that. So I'm incumbent, it's incumbent upon me as a learning developer not to position myself as an expert in any given field other than learning development. But that doesn't mean I can't share the experiences that learners have shared with me, and hopefully we'll get a chance to explore some of them in our conversation this morning.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well. Like you're saying there, who is the expert on our own learning? And I mean, if you've been in the system for a while, in the educational system, you kind of know what works for you. So having a prescriptive approach to learning and like, this is how you learn in the best way, I can see how that is not helpful. Yes, there might be tips and tricks on this is what you can do, but it's all about what works for you. So, for example, in my case, I was diagnosed with ADHD just a few months ago. And after, sorry, and after that, I've been talking to other people, other students with ADHD, and talking to them, I can see that strategies that are working for them will not work for me. Same diagnosis, but it will not work. That is not how my brain works. So I think it's really important what you're saying here, that to have this conversation of like opening it up and like what works for you, learning together what works.
Absolutely. And for me, and kind of reflect on the conversations we've had in the lead up to this, and getting a chance to explore some of my own journey in this regard, and kind of awareness raising within myself, and the kind of conversations that I've had, and how much I've gained from those from other learners, both at Strathclyde and at Glasgow, where I worked specifically with the Disability Service since 2006, albeit latterly in an outsourced capacity. And that's, again, that wasn't technically as a learning developer, it is as a study skills or learning support tutor. And that's purely on a one-to-one basis. So there's, for me, what I recognised from the outset, there's quite a lot of overlap between learning development and the kind of conversations I was having under this umbrella of support for specific learning differences, students who are having mental health experiences. And because, of course, as you know, in 2013, when I put together a tutor manual, basically, because I was involved in staff training at Glasgow for the Disability Service, I put together a pack of resources, one for students, one for staff, that deliberately reflected each other, so there would be quite literally, you know, like on the same page with understanding what the roles were and responsibilities. What I realised when I reviewed it, so this is only 2013, was that I wasn't actually talking about neurodiversity. And it struck me as that was quite significant, because it's become a term now that is contested and debated, rightly so, but I certainly accept it as being a meaningful and a useful way to understand different types of learning experiences. But it's, you know, as recently as 2013, it wasn't something that I was talking about, and it wasn't something that I was sharing with colleagues or inviting learners to consider. So I thought that was quite striking. I think it's something served a useful opportunity for me to reflect and think, well, actually, that's quite a journey I've been on since that point, where I thought what I was doing was quite progressive by bringing in learning development into what had been purely study skills remediation support, trying to make it as learner-centred and reflective of the kind of experiences, experiential differences that you're describing as a researcher that learners have from the get-go. But I think the issues around that can be amplified for people who are experienced learning that they recognise as perhaps described as being atypical in some way or being impacted. But I thought it was quite striking, so I thought I'd share that. But I think it's something I'll reflect on as well. And it's a case of, well, should I have been a bit more aware than I was? This is always one of these healthy perspectives to have on an issue.
Right. I mean, we are all learners, and we continue to learn throughout our lives, right? So I know that you talked about before about when you have worked with students who are from the neurodiverse population. What could you give a few examples of what strategy they have come up with and what works for them? Not to be prescriptive, but just
no, absolutely, just in the sharing aspects. No, absolutely. And as I say, I think because my role as somebody who works mostly one-to-one with individual learners, it affords the opportunity to have such conversations and to not just to see what people are doing on the page as a marker, but to actually, you know, discuss and have them explain to me, because I don't know their motivations or the reasoning to understand what they're doing. So no, absolutely. I think so. One of the things that I'm increasingly working on in my own practice with neurodiverse learners is this idea of using some of the characteristics of the learning that have been successful and seeing how they can be adapted into the current learning or research context. So one of the things that I've certainly seen been quite successful is for students who find it a challenge to remain focused on a single task, is to be identifying different tasks that have a degree of validity to the core activity. So if this is taking a research thesis, for example, if someone is involved in research for a particular chapter, it may be recognising that at some point during that writing cycle for that day, that activity, they're going to have thoughts about other parts of the thesis, which they might feel encouraged to suppress, to learn to focus on the task at hand. And what I've certainly seen a few times is researchers exploring the opportunities to actually go with those side thoughts rather than suppressing them and assuming that this is a characteristic of their specific learning difference or their neurodiverse experience, something to be suppressed, but actually recognising that in other areas, we might actually recognise this as inspiration. We might recognise this as one of these breakthroughs that we get through the subconscious, where we're problem solving in the background, while to the fore we are trying to focus on something else. And certainly, I think researchers have the flexibility, perhaps more than undergraduates, because of the way the teaching and learning and scenarios work, is to perhaps go with some of these opportunities, with these innovations, what might be seen as procrastinations or distractions, and perhaps even set opportunities for that up. So that might be a few or four tasks that they want to work on, and depending on their motivation or their focus or inspiration, they perhaps see the legitimacy of moving from one task to another in a way that isn't prescribed by a clock or a countdown or a Pomodoro technique, but rather than their own experience and following the trains of thought and recognizing the legitimacy of having parallel trains of thought rather than the more neurotypical approach that's prescribed of having focus and primacy of an individual activity. I think for me, the more times I've seen researchers experiment with these, the more I learn from their experimentations if they're kind enough to share them with me. But the more often I see that some of my own practices, as somebody who isn't neurodiverse, but being visually impaired, I will often move between different tasks depending on how taxing I find the primary task. So if I feel I'm getting eye strain or I'm losing focus, concentration, I'll always have another job to do. But I'm fortunate because a lot of what I do as a professional is reactive to an extent and relationship driven. I already know that there's a legitimacy in that other tasks. So I don't think it is procrastination. Whereas I think researchers and learners perhaps feel that what in other contexts might be legitimate side tasks or subtasks are perhaps mislabeled as procrastinations or distractions. And I think it's an interesting idea rather than kind of serial mono processing. That's to recognise the validity and the legitimacy of parallel processing and parallel allocation of task management. Now, I'm not saying that there's hard science behind this. What I'm talking is about the experience that learners have shared and the successes and challenges faced with it. But it does seem to be an interesting body of kind of emerging activity that's happening for neurodiverse learners. So I think that's certainly one thing that I've found particularly interesting in recent years.
Yeah, I really resonate with that actually, in that because I'm a PhD student, so I'm in that research culture, and there's this idea that you need to focus for hours upon hours on one thing, and that is what research is. And just knowing that it is actually possible to shift the focus and doing it mindfully. Like I have this in place. So instead of when I lose focus, I go to, social media, I have a different task that is valuable for my research that I can shift to, and then I can shift back and forth. That's really good. I'm just wondering if something could be for people who are like hyper focused, like they get lost in their work for hours upon hours, and then they forget to eat, they forget to, you know, is that something that they could? I don't know. It's up to them, I suppose, to see what works.
And I think that is that conversation that's so important in all of this. And I think this is obviously, emphasised at the moment in our current situation, because so many of us are stuck in little boxes somewhere, and this is all we see of other people. And obviously there's a lot of communication lost with that. But I think it also formalises our communications, where, I'm thinking conversation I've had with a couple of students at Glasgow recently, where they're not perhaps having the conversations that they would otherwise have about how people do things, and they're very focused on what people are doing. So simply studying in the same room, I'm thinking that the situation where maybe 2 or 3 people are in a research centre or in a lab or in a small departmental library space conducting research, you pick up information about how people do things. Even if you've no idea what on earth they're doing, you can see their patterns of behaviour. You can see how they move, and when they eat, when they don't eat, what they do at the desk, things they don't do. There's so much information we pick up, albeit not necessarily consciously in a focused way, to develop a kind of manual or how to do a PhD. But nevertheless, we pick up that information, and often we will respond and ask about it. And I think in the current context, it's difficult to get that extra information. So it makes the conversations about how even more important. I think having forums to do that, such as networks of differently minded individuals, like diversity networks, I think these are an important way to share that information about how, as well as the why, or even the what it is that's taking place. Because I think it's questions we don't always ask each other, but we sometimes acquire the information through just being around people.
Yeah, I think that also relates to another conversations that we've had before, that you said that, especially for neurodiverse learners, the pandemic and being bound to your home has been really hard, because a lot of people need to have that workspace to go to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know 3 PhD students at Glasgow who have had to temporarily, I hope, and I'm sure they hope, they temporarily suspend their research because they simply can't conduct it at home. The impact of space is quite pronounced on their experience, and it was healthily compartmentalised for them. That when they went to the library, when they went to the department, when they used research spaces, in some cases their professional places of work as well, when they conducted research in those spaces, it allowed them to healthily compartmentalise that activity, which meant when they went home, it wasn't there. There's all the stresses and anxieties and burdens and responsibilities we feel as researchers that are internalised, of course, but not being able and not being used to research at home was a very healthy thing for them, because they knew when they were home there was space away. And I think in a very practical way, and I think this is true of the neurodiverse, of neurotypical, of all learners and researchers, I think having a space away from learning and research is incredibly healthy and necessary. So I think we all feel that just now as an issue. But I have certainly seen it as a more heightened area of and I guess it is concern for those individuals who are experiencing that they're just not able to conduct their research from home, not because of any physical limitation, but because of spatial and conceptual limitations, and they can be just as real. The spaces that we associate with having positive research and learning experiences matter, and they can't always be transferred from one room to another or one physical location to another, because it's embodied emotional experience, and we can't just transpose that into another frame of reference easily. Some people achieve it, other people it is a much greater challenge. But so yeah, I think I think certainly for some neurodiverse researchers, the spaces in which they research are very, very important, and often for very good, positive reasons, I would argue.
Right. You also touched there on that this might actually, especially for the space and the pandemic and how we do study, how we do research, that this might be hard for everyone. And I guess that also takes us to that these tips and tricks on how you study, it's not necessarily only down to neurodiverse learners. It's like everyone can take part of these ways of approaching your learning. And also from that, you don't need to have like a formal diagnosis to kind of know that something's not, that you are different. I can only talk from my own experience that I'm 35 now and I just got my diagnosis, but I knew when I was 21, 22 that this is probably the case with me. And just to, people should be aware of that, and just, that's okay as well. Look at what can be done and take part of these. If you find a group, if you're self-diagnosed, or use the opportunities that are there to learn more about how you can be a better, no, not a better, that's the wrong word, to be be the learner that you want to be, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, it's one of the conversations that I have both at Glasgow and Strathclyde with learners who have gone down a diagnostic pathway, or who have not, or people who, as you describe, I think this is true certainly for a lot of mature students. I say this as somebody who came to university as a mature student as well, that we can feel that our learning has been impacted by experience. Now, there might not be a neurological or a learning difference that is the direct cause of that experience. It may be having care responsibilities. It may simply having had come from a school where there was low expectations of our academic level of achievement. There's a whole load of reasons to have reasons to second guess or challenging experiences in your learning at formative stages. And I think the recognising the validity of difference, both neurological, but more broadly learning differences. And this is for me a movement away from I think where I was in 2013, which was recognising the validity and acceptance of divergent thinking, to where I am now in 2021, and to see the absolute necessity of it. And it's rather than, and I had, I think where I was then was very much about my own experience as a disabled adult, of trying to understand and have positive experiences, and wishing other people who perceive themselves to be different, as you've described, in any conceivable way, and to have validity there of their experiences. Now I see it as in a far more, albeit politically driven to an extent, but also broader than a kind of general's equality, equity basis, that this is just about the necessity and this to celebrate thinking differently, because the innovations, the breakthrough, the progress we achieve, not just in our academic disciplines, but in society and for ourselves, come through thinking differently. And sometimes we don't think differently naturally in ways that are healthy or make us feel good. But sometimes we do. And sometimes perhaps it's not until we're in conversation with other people who are expressing different ways of thinking and practice from ourselves that we recognise how important it is to hear those differences and to celebrate them for the contribution that they make, not just to our disciplines, but to ourselves as learners and researchers. And I think that's something that in my own practice, I have the opportunity to do, but it's certainly something we, as a service at Strathclyde at least, we want to be more involved in, is to create spaces that are not just inclusive and have appropriate forms of representation, but are also places of challenge and engagement, and places to share difference, but also to celebrate it. That's some of the very practical stuff that we're also talking about as well.
Yeah, I think that would be really good. I can only speak for myself, but I would really enjoy having a space where I could just speak to others who are in a similar situation, and having to, I shouldn't say conform, but find ways in a neurotypical world, and how can I adapt to it, and how can I adapt my own learning experience so I can still, so in my example, I still need to produce a thesis, but the way there might differ from a neurotypical person, and that's okay. But how do I do that? And having a group or a forum where I can discuss these things and hear others, just to celebrate it as well as learn from others. I think that would be a really valuable place for me.
No, absolutely, I agree, and it's certainly that lots of other people I've had this similar conversation with have expressed it in a very similar way to yourself, David. In preparation for today, I was really listening to a thesis chapter from a student from Glasgow, and could you talk about, how practical different ways that people can carry out the day-to-day task and navigate the neurotypical world with their own divergent experiences. And this student who submitted a PhD a couple of years ago now, which was on specific learning differences and how they're represented in various different forms. Her conclusion of her thesis was submitted as a piece of audio. So she kind of intentionally resisted the primacy of the printed word, consciously engaged and embraced her neurodiversity, and delivered an unmediated, unscripted presentation of thought that was at the summation and the conclusion of her thesis. And very, very successfully, unsurprising, because she'd been working on a thesis, she was an accomplished researcher, she knew what she was talking about. And not because it was just her experience, because she was an accomplished researcher and she'd done the miles. She was more than able to describe the journey. But unless we hear about those activities and we see how divergent research can be and how we share our findings and how we conduct it, it is difficult to know what's possible. But I think forums where people share the product of difference in different approaches, the healthier it is, rather than it being an abstract conversation about rights, and which is, of course, necessary and important part of the discussion, but sometimes being very practical models, objects, forms of representation that we can look at and understand, and perhaps not choose, but appreciate the different thought that went into its construction. And it gives us those internal and external forms of dialogue that are just inform our worldview, never mind our practical research skill set.
Perfect. So I think that's a really good way to end our conversation here, to look to the future and what can be done. I know that you're interested in facilitating or creating a group at least Strathclyde where you work as in the study skills service, but these services are present at other universities as well. So if the viewers are at Strathclyde, they can get in contact with you, and if they're at the other universities, there will be services where they will be able to speak to someone about these issues and difficulties, or maybe not difficulties, but different ways of learning. So, Alex, always really nice to speak to you. I really feel that you're a good ally to our community. And yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, David.